Students, welcome to this week's lecture. This week's lecture is going to be the American Revolution and the immediate aftermath, mostly focusing on the Revolution. A couple of things to say about the immediate aftermath. Yet again, there should be a document that I post that you can use to help you take notes. It kind of has the main outline of the order that I'll be going over it, and so if you want to open that up and add your notes to that as we go along, hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier to follow. Also, I'll be going, trying to talk. I was watching the lecture from last week, and I was realizing that I mean, I know you can pause and play it at will or whatever, but I'll try to go over it a little bit slower in the way that I talk, just to make it a little bit easier to take notes. But we're going to start, you can see in point 1, it says from colonies to states. I'm going to start there. What do I mean by that? What do I mean from colonies to states? Well, what I mean is that when the states began to pass their own state constitutions, not obviously the American Constitution, which wouldn't come until years after the war, but as different colonies started passing their own individual constitutions, it was their way of saying, and this was even before the Declaration of Independence, it was their way of saying, we're not subject to British law anymore. We have our own law. We have our own constitution. We're not colonies of the British Empire anymore. We're states. We're our own states. And at that time, you can't even really think of it as like our modern conception of the United States. They were really saying we're individual states, like France is a state, or Germany, well, not at the time, but Germany is a state, or England is a state, or whatever. They were saying New Hampshire, New Hampshire are our own state, subject to our own laws. And yes, we sympathize with these other states, and we're joining together to overthrow you, but we're an individual state. So that's what I mean by from colonies to states. So how did that happen? Well, it began to happen as military hostilities began. We talked a little bit, we just mentioned in passing last week, Lexington and Concord. That was obviously the very first battle, if you want to call it that, although it wasn't really. But that was in 1775, and that was the first case where the colonies, and the British were openly fighting. It was the shot heard around the world, or as people say. Obviously, it wasn't a big deal. Nobody won or lost, but it was just the idea that the colonies and the British, hostilities had actually begun. And then as a result of that, a lot of militias came and they took Boston. And that was kind of the main, okay, this is happening. We're fighting. We are fighting the British. It's a big moment or whatever, and all these militias came and kind of took Boston. It was, if this isn't going to turn into an all-out war, it's only going to be because the Second Continental Congress and Great Britain sign a peace treaty. It's not like the Boston Massacre or even Lexington and Concord. Those could have been seen as just angry citizens going a little bit over the line. It wasn't a huge deal. Once we engaged and took Boston, it was, all right, this is happening. Unless someone signs a peace treaty, this is happening. And that's when a lot of the states began to start forming their own state constitutions. And once you ratify a state constitution, obviously the Declaration of Independence was a big deal. But once individual states began ratifying their own constitutions, that was illegal. They were rebels. If the people who ratified the Constitution had been captured, they would have been hung. I mean, at this point, you are you're essentially declaring your independence individually as a state, and then all collectively as 13 states they would declare their independence in the Declaration of Independence. But in ratifying your own state constitution, you've already essentially done that individually, just not yet as a group. And then the third thing that happened after Boston was obviously the Battle of Bunker Hill, also in 1775. The funny thing about Bunker Hill is it was technically the British won the battle, which is hilarious because then, even at the time, and certainly now, Bunker Hill is like, it's a rallying cry. You know, we took it to the British at Bunker Hill, which we did. Technically, they won, but the reason it's seen that way is because I think they had about twice as many casualties. It was something like 1,000 or 1,100 British casualties versus 400 or 500 American casualties. And so it was seen as a big deal, especially because the whole idea was the British were trying to take, Bunker Hill or whatever. They were trying to come up the hill, and they came up once, and we fought them back. They came up twice, and we fought them back. They came up 3 times, we fought them back. They came up a 4th time, they won. And so there's this idea that we were hanging with them, right? I mean, this is the greatest military in the world, the British, and this ragtag group of American militia who don't even have, George Washington isn't even there, or even in charge of the army at the time. It's just, a ragtag group of people, and we're hanging right with them, and it took them 4 tries. I mean, come on, we're awesome. That was the general feeling at the time, or whatever. And there was a degree of truth to that. After that is when then the Second Continental Congress convened, and that was when, and we talked about the Second Continental Congress a little bit last week, and so I won't go over that, but that's, at that point, after those 3 things is when they convened. We talked about how they, extended the offer to Britain to end hostilities or whatever, and King George did, and he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. And so as a result of King George issuing the Proclamation of Rebellion, everyone understood, okay, now we're at war. George Washington, in early 1776 is made the commander of the army. And at that point, we invade Canada. That was Canada. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Canada, only because we took it and then they took it back, and we never ended up keeping it, and it wasn't really a big deal. But I mean, it was a big deal now in the sense that it was after the Proclamation of Rebellion. Okay, what's going to happen? Everyone was kind of waiting and seeing. We went into Canada. We took Montreal, which was fine or whatever, but not a big deal. Bigger deal was when George Washington became commander of the army. He forced the British to completely evacuate Boston, including loyalists, and so that meant that there was a time in early 1776 where the British and loyalists had no control over any aspect of the 13 colonies. It wasn't that long of a time, but there was a brief time. They evacuated Boston, and we had everything. There were still loyalists around. It's not like everyone in the 13 states agreed. But they didn't have control over any area of government. They had they weren't camping out anywhere. There was no part of the 13 states that the British or loyalists had control over. Could have ended there. Would have been a lot better if it had ended there. If the British had decided it wasn't worth it, and technically they should have decided that it wasn't worth it, because their colonies in the Caribbean were infinitely more important to their empire than their colonies in America. But whatever, you don't need to know that. That was just a side thing. So let's talk about 1776 and 1777, because it was during those 2 years that, honestly, there was the war should have ended. The British should have won in 1776 and 1777. There's just no other way to put it. They had probably, at that point, if you go back and you were, a betting man or a betting woman, if you went back during those 2 years, there was probably about 50-1 odds that the British were going to win. I mean, there was no reason why. I mean, obviously there were reasons because it happened, but there weren't very many good reasons why the British didn't win during those 2 years. So what happened? Well, first, they came and they took New York, which was important because then New York would kind of become the base um, for the British for the rest of the war. A lot of loyalists would go there to hide out there. New York was the capital, if you want to think about it that way. It was the capital of their operations in America. Um, and so they take New York. The Battle of Brooklyn is what it was called. It was one of the largest engagements of the war and would remain so for the rest of the war. Um, Washington um, was the commander of the army that was in New York at the time, and so it was a direct Washington loss, which Washington lost almost every single battle he was in, which is hilarious. Um, so the British come, they beat Washington at the Battle of Brooklyn. When they take New York, they after the Battle of Brooklyn, they wanted to meet with the Second Continental Congress to negotiate an end to the hostilities, which you may say sounds funny. I mean, they come and they win one battle, and all of a sudden they think that we're going to be like, oh well, it's over. They took New York. We're done. Let's sign the peace treaty. Let's get what we can. It sounds a little bit ridiculous. I mean, it would have been like, I don't know how much you know about the Civil War, but it would have been like after the Confederates beat the Union at the Battle of Manassas, for the South to be like, sweet, we won. Let's sign the treaty now. Maybe they'll grant us our independence right now. Hey, Abraham Lincoln, let's talk. We won Battle of Manassas, right? So we can go free because we won the first battle. It's like that, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. But the difference is that there was still